The helicopter's rotor blades cut through the humid morning air as Manny Pacquiao gazed down at the endless green canopy of Mindanao's mountainous terrain. What had started as a routine visit to promote his youth boxing program in General Santos City had taken an unexpected turn when his local coordinator, Angelo, mentioned remote communities that rarely saw outsiders. The aircraft descended toward a small clearing, and Manny felt his stomach tighten with anticipation. Below, he could make out a cluster of modest houses scattered across a plateau, their tin roofs glinting like scattered coins in the sunlight. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and tiny figures emerged from their homes, shading their eyes against the morning glare. As the helicopter touched down, children materialized from every direction, their faces bright with curiosity and wonder. Manny stepped onto the uneven ground. His designer sneakers immediately caked with red clay. The air smelled of wood smoke, tropical flowers, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The scent of isolation, of a place forgotten by time. An elderly man approached with measured steps, his weathered hands clasped respectfully. Angelo quickly made introductions, explaining that this was Bayani, the barangay captain who had been leading this community of nearly 200 families for over 15 years. The man's eyes held a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope as he processed the reality of having the world's most famous Filipino standing in his village. Manny spent the morning walking through narrow paths between houses, observing daily life that seemed suspended in another era. Women carried water in plastic containers from a distant well, their backs bent under the weight. Children played with toys fashioned from bottle caps and wire, their laughter echoing off the surrounding mountains. Elderly residents sat in doorways, their faces marked by years of quiet endurance. The most striking observation came when Manny asked about access to the outside world. Bayani gestured toward a barely visible trail winding down the mountainside, explaining that the nearest paved road was a 4-hour trek through treacherous terrain. During the rainy season, the path became impassable, leaving the community completely cut off for weeks at a time. Manny watched a young mother named Izagani struggle with her sick infant, knowing that reaching medical help would require an impossible journey. He observed teenagers whose education ended at elementary level because traveling to high school was simply not feasible. He met farmers like Renato, who grew excellent coffee beans but had no way to transport their harvest to markets, forcing them to sell to middlemen at devastating prices. The community's resilience amazed him, but their unnecessary suffering troubled his soul. These were his people, Filipinos who deserved the same opportunities as those living in connected areas. They possessed the same dreams, the same potential, the same right to progress and prosperity. As the day progressed, Manny found himself calculating distances, visualizing routes, and imagining possibilities. His mind, trained to find solutions in the boxing ring, began working on a different kind of problem. The mountain terrain was challenging but not impossible. The engineering would be complex but achievable. The costs would be significant but manageable. When evening approached and it was time to leave, dozens of residents gathered at the makeshift helipad. Their faces reflected a mixture of gratitude and melancholy. Grateful for the rare visit, melancholy knowing it might be years before another outsider reached their isolated home. Manny climbed back into the helicopter with his heart heavy and his mind racing. As the aircraft lifted off and the village grew smaller below, he pressed his palm against the window and made a silent promise to those forgotten faces. They had given him their time, their stories, and their trust. He would not let their isolation continue to define their futures. The flight back to General Santos City felt longer than usual, each passing minute filled with images that refused to leave Manny's mind. The faces of those children playing with makeshift toys, the weathered hands of farmers who could never reach proper markets, the exhausted expression of that young mother carrying her sick child, they all swirled together in his consciousness like scenes from a movie he couldn't turn off. By the time he reached his hotel that evening, Manny had filled 3 pages of his notebook with rough sketches and calculations. He wasn't an engineer, but years of strategic thinking in boxing had taught him to visualize complex problems from multiple angles. The terrain was challenging, certainly, but he had seen roads built through more difficult mountain passes during his travels around the world. His first call was to Emil, a civil engineer who had worked on several infrastructure projects across Mindanao. They met the following morning in a quiet conference room where Manny spread out topographical maps and shared photographs he had taken during his village visit. Emil studied the materials with growing interest, occasionally making notes and asking detailed questions about the exact locations and elevations. The engineer's initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. The proposed route would require significant cutting through rocky terrain and the construction of at least 2 major bridges, but nothing that modern engineering couldn't accomplish. The bigger challenges would be logistics, transporting heavy equipment to such remote locations, and securing the necessary environmental clearances for construction in protected watershed areas. Over the next several days, Manny immersed himself in research he had never imagined doing. He studied government road construction budgets, analyzed similar projects in other mountainous regions of the Philippines, and consulted with Jericho, a transportation expert who had spent 15 years working on rural connectivity initiatives. The financial projections were sobering but not impossible. A proper 2-lane highway connecting the mountain communities to the existing road network would cost approximately 250 million pesos. It was more money than most individuals could comprehend. But Manny had learned to think in terms of long-term impact rather than immediate expense. During a quiet evening at home, he shared his growing vision with Jinky. She listened intently as he described the isolated villages, the impossible daily struggles of their residents, and his emerging plan to change their circumstances permanently. Her initial concern about the massive financial commitment gradually gave way to understanding and support as she recognized the depth of his conviction. Jinky had seen this look in her husband's eyes before, the same focused determination that had carried him through impossible odds in the boxing ring. When Manny believed in something completely, obstacles became merely problems to solve rather than reasons to abandon the mission. The next phase involved consulting with Renato, a government relations specialist who understood the complex approval processes required for major infrastructure projects. The bureaucratic challenges would be formidable, involving multiple agencies, environmental impact studies, and lengthy review periods that could stretch into years. But Manny had learned patience through decades of training and competition. He understood that meaningful victories required sustained effort over time, not just explosive moments of action. This project would demand the same qualities that had made him a world champion: strategic planning, unwavering persistence, and the ability to continue fighting when others might surrender. As the week progressed, his informal conversations evolved into formal meetings. Maps covered the walls of his home office, marked with colored lines indicating proposed routes, potential challenges, and environmental considerations. Stacks of technical reports grew higher on his desk, each one adding another layer of understanding to the massive undertaking he was contemplating. The vision was crystallizing into something concrete and achievable. Those forgotten faces in the mountain village would not remain forgotten. Their isolation was not a permanent condition, but a problem with a solution, and Manny Pacquiao was prepared to be that solution. The air conditioning hummed relentlessly in the Department of Public Works and Highways office in Davao City, but Manny still felt perspiration gathering on his forehead as he sat across from Carlo, the regional director who held significant power over infrastructure approvals in Mindanao. The stack of documents between them seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute, as Carlo methodically explained the labyrinthine approval process: environmental impact assessments, geological surveys, indigenous peoples, rights consultations, budget allocations, competitive bidding requirements. Each item on the checklist represented weeks or months of additional bureaucratic navigation. Manny listened patiently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions, but internally his frustration was mounting with every procedural hurdle. The following week brought meetings with Joaquin from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, who outlined the extensive environmental clearance requirements for construction in watershed areas. The proposed highway route would cross through several protected zones, requiring detailed studies of potential impacts on local wildlife, water systems, and forest conservation efforts. Manny found himself learning an entirely new vocabulary of bureaucratic terms and procedural requirements: ECC certificates, DENR clearances, NCIP compliance, LGU endorsements. Each acronym represented another government office, another set of forms, another potential delay in reaching those isolated communities that continued to haunt his thoughts. The most frustrating meeting came with Andres, a senior official in the Budget and Management Office, who seemed genuinely sympathetic to the project's humanitarian goals, but explained the rigid requirements for public infrastructure funding. Government resources were already committed through detailed multi-year planning cycles, and inserting a new project would require either waiting for the next budget cycle or finding alternative funding sources. Manny began spending entire days navigating government buildings, moving from office to office with growing stacks of paperwork. The fluorescent lights and endless corridors felt surreal after experiencing the natural beauty and simple authenticity of the mountain communities. Here, in these sterile spaces, the urgent human needs of forgotten villages seemed to dissolve into abstract policy discussions and procedural technicalities. Raphael, his legal advisor, helped decode the most complex requirements and identified potential pathways through the regulatory maze. The process would require approximately 18 months of approvals under the most optimistic scenarios, assuming no major obstacles or objections emerged during the review periods. But obstacles did emerge. Miguel, representing local environmental groups, raised concerns about construction impacts on endangered bird species that nested in the mountainous regions. Edgardo, speaking for indigenous rights organizations, demanded extensive consultations with tribal communities whose ancestral domains might be affected by the proposed highway route. Each valid concern added another layer of complexity to an already challenging approval process. Manny respected these perspectives and understood their importance, but the delays felt increasingly painful when he remembered the faces of children who couldn't access proper education and families who couldn't reach medical care during emergencies. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Roberto, a veteran infrastructure consultant, suggested exploring public-private partnership models that could accelerate the approval process while maintaining proper oversight and environmental protections. This approach would allow private funding to move more quickly through certain approval channels while still meeting all regulatory requirements. Manny seized on this possibility with renewed energy. If government funding timelines were too restrictive, he would find other ways to finance the project. His boxing career had generated substantial income, and he had investments and business interests that could be redirected toward this humanitarian initiative. Late one evening, sitting in his home office surrounded by regulatory documents and feasibility studies, Manny felt the weight of bureaucratic complexity pressing down on him. But beneath that pressure, his core motivation remained unshaken. Those mountain communities deserved connectivity and opportunity, regardless of how many forms needed to be completed or how many offices required visits. The bureaucratic mountains were proving as challenging to climb as the physical ones, but champions were defined by their ability to persist through seemingly impossible obstacles. Word traveled slowly through the mountain communities, carried by the few individuals who made the treacherous 4-hour trek to the outside world for essential supplies. When Isagani returned from his monthly journey to purchase medicine for his ailing father, he brought news that seemed too extraordinary to believe. The famous boxer Manny Pacquiao was planning to build a highway that would connect their isolated villages to the world below. The information spread through the community like ripples in still water, moving from house to house through quiet conversations and incredulous whispers. Mayumi, the village's informal leader among the women, listened to the story with a mixture of hope and protective skepticism. Too many promises had been made to their communities over the years by politicians seeking votes, only to be forgotten once elections ended. But this was different, according to Isagani's account. This wasn't a campaign promise or a political gesture. It was a personal commitment from someone who had actually visited their village, walked their paths, and seen their struggles firsthand. The memory of Manny's genuine attention during his helicopter visit was still fresh in everyone's minds. Clarita, the community's elderly school teacher, remembered the thoughtful questions he had asked about her students, educational challenges. Unlike other visitors who had offered hollow encouragement, Manny had listened with the intensity of someone genuinely trying to understand and solve problems. His notebook had been filled with detailed observations, not just polite notes for appearances. As days passed, the initial excitement began mixing with deeper emotions. Luz Viminda, whose teenage daughter had exceptional academic potential but no way to continue her education, found herself crying unexpectedly while preparing evening meals. The possibility that her child might actually have opportunities beyond the mountain plateau felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Josefina, who had spent 15 years carrying water from distant sources, allowed herself to imagine a future where supply trucks could actually reach their community, bringing not just convenience but dignity. The prospect of children growing up without the daily struggle for basic necessities seemed almost too wonderful to trust. The skeptics remained vocal in their caution. Isadora, whose husband had died years earlier because medical help was unreachable during a critical emergency, refused to let hope override her hard-earned wariness. Government projects had been announced before she reminded anyone who would listen, only to disappear into bureaucratic delays and funding shortfalls. But even the skeptics couldn't entirely suppress their curiosity when Benilda's cousin arrived with more detailed information. The project wasn't just a vague promise. Actual engineers had been consulting on route planning, environmental assessments were being conducted, and formal applications had been submitted to multiple government agencies. Marilu, whose small children had never seen a proper vehicle except for the occasional helicopter landing, began having conversations with her husband about what connectivity might mean for their family's future. Would their children need to leave the mountains to find opportunities, or would opportunities finally be able to reach them? The emotional weight of sustained hope proved challenging for a community accustomed to accepting limitations. Teresa found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with possibilities that had seemed impossible for so long. The idea that her grandchildren might grow up in a connected world rather than an isolated one felt revolutionary. When Angelo, the same coordinator who had originally facilitated Manny's visit, returned to the village with an update on the project's progress, nearly the entire community gathered to hear his report. The formal approval processes were advancing steadily, funding sources had been identified, and preliminary construction timelines were being developed. As Angelo spoke, something profound shifted in the collective emotional atmosphere of the community. Hope, which had been carefully guarded and tentatively expressed, began to solidify into genuine expectation. The highway project was becoming real, transforming from an impossible dream into an approaching reality that would forever change their isolated existence. The rumble of heavy machinery echoed through the mountains for the first time in living memory, a mechanical symphony that announced the transformation of an impossible dream into tangible reality. Amihan stood at the edge of her small garden, watching in amazement as massive excavators navigated the challenging terrain below, their bright yellow forms moving like determined beetles against the green mountainside. 3 months had passed since the final governmental approvals were secured, and now engineering teams led by Mayumi, a seasoned road construction specialist, were executing the most ambitious connectivity project ever attempted in this remote region of Mindanao. The logistics alone were staggering. Every piece of equipment had been transported by helicopter or assembled on site from components small enough to navigate the existing mountain trails. Clarita, the village school teacher, brought her students to observe the construction activities as part of their daily lessons. The children pressed against the temporary safety barriers, their eyes wide with wonder, as they watched Luzviminda, a skilled heavy equipment operator, maneuver her machine with precision through rocky terrain that had seemed impassable just weeks before. The first breakthrough came when construction crews successfully blasted through a challenging rock formation that had represented the project's biggest technical obstacle. Josefina felt the controlled explosion reverberate through her bones as she stood on her porch, and tears unexpectedly filled her eyes as she realized this was the sound of isolation ending forever. Manny arrived at the construction site on a humid Thursday morning, his helicopter landing in a designated clearing that would eventually become a roadside rest area. He walked the emerging roadway with Isadora, the project's chief engineer, discussing progress reports and timeline adjustments, while community members gathered at respectful distances to witness this historic moment. The sight of their champion walking on what would soon become their highway created an emotional surge through the assembled crowd. Benilda clutched her young daughter's hand, whispering explanations about how this road would change everything for their family's future. The child stared at the wide ribbon of cleared earth stretching down the mountainside, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was being created for her benefit. Construction challenges emerged daily, requiring creative solutions from the engineering team. Marilu, the project's environmental compliance officer, worked tirelessly to ensure that wildlife corridors remained intact and water sources stayed protected while still allowing the road to progress through sensitive ecological zones. The workers themselves became part of the community fabric during construction months. Teresa opened her small store to provide meals and refreshments for the construction crews, creating the first cash-based economy the village had experienced in years. The influx of wages and commercial activity offered a preview of the economic opportunities that highway connectivity would bring. Progress was measured not just in kilometers of completed roadway, but in the changing expressions on community members' faces. Angelo, who had coordinated Manny's original visit, noticed how conversations had shifted from cautious hope to confident planning. Families were discussing education opportunities for their children, farmers were researching market prices for their crops, and entrepreneurs were considering small businesses that would serve travelers on the new highway. By the end of the 5th construction month, vehicles could navigate the first major section of the highway, connecting the most isolated communities to a staging area halfway down the mountain. Renato, whose coffee farm had produced excellent beans for decades without market access, loaded his harvest onto a truck for the first time in his life, watching with profound satisfaction as his products began their journey toward proper commercial markets. The sound of progress had replaced the sound of silence in these forgotten mountains. Each day brought the road closer to completion, and each day brought these communities closer to a connected future they had never dared to imagine possible. 8 months into construction, the highway had transformed from an ambitious vision into a serpentine reality winding its way through the mountains of Mindanao. Emil, the project's chief surveyor, marked another milestone as his team completed the most challenging bridge construction, spanning a deep ravine that had seemed impossible to cross when the project began. The rainy season brought unexpected complications that tested everyone's resolve. Landslides triggered by heavy monsoon rains buried sections of newly completed roadway, forcing construction crews to rebuild entire segments while implementing additional stabilization measures. Violeta, the geological consultant, worked around the clock to identify safer routing alternatives that would withstand future weather challenges. Despite these setbacks, the road continued its steady advance toward the isolated communities. Remedios, whose small pharmacy had served mountain residents for 20 years, began receiving her first delivery trucks loaded with medical supplies that had previously required dangerous multi-day journeys to obtain. The relief in her eyes as she inventoried fresh medications reflected the life-saving impact that connectivity was already providing. Community members had become active participants in the construction process, contributing local knowledge and volunteer labor wherever possible. Sylvia organized teams of village women to prepare meals for construction workers, while Felicidad coordinated with local men to clear vegetation and assist with manual labor tasks that didn't require specialized equipment. The economic transformation was becoming visible throughout the region. Hermintia Pacquiao, who had operated a small weaving business producing beautiful traditional textiles, suddenly found herself receiving orders from buyers in distant cities who had heard about her work through newly established communication networks. Her products, which had previously served only local needs, were now generating substantial income for her extended family. Manny returned to monitor progress during the most challenging phase of construction, when crews were cutting through the steepest mountain grade. He walked alongside Jovita, the site supervisor, discussing technical solutions while observing how the road was already changing daily life in partially connected communities. The sight of children walking to expanded educational opportunities along newly paved sections filled him with deep satisfaction. Socorro, a bright teenager who had previously been limited to elementary-level instruction, was now able to attend high school in a neighboring community, traveling safely along the highway rather than attempting impossible mountain paths. Construction challenges continued to test the project's resilience. Margarita, the environmental protection specialist, identified rare plant species that required careful relocation before road cutting could proceed in certain areas. These protective measures added time and complexity to the construction schedule, but maintained the project's commitment to responsible development. Weather delays and technical obstacles pushed the completion date several months beyond original projections, but community patience remained strong because progress was visible and tangible. Karina watched daily as the road crept closer to her village, measuring advancement, not in abstract engineering terms, but in the growing possibility that her elderly parents would soon have access to proper medical facilities. Local businesses began adapting to serve the increasing traffic of construction vehicles and early travelers. Eugenia converted her small home into a roadside eatery, offering traditional Filipino meals to workers and visitors who represented the first steady stream of outsiders her community had ever experienced. The psychological impact of approaching connectivity was profound throughout the mountain communities. Pilar noticed how conversations had shifted from acceptance of limitations to active planning for expanded opportunities. Families were making decisions about education, business investments, and lifestyle changes that would have been impossible to consider during their years of isolation. As the highway approached its final phase of construction, the communities it would serve had already begun transforming in anticipation of their connected future. The morning of the highway inauguration dawned clear and bright, with mountain mist lifting gracefully from the valleys below, as if nature itself was preparing for this historic celebration. Saturnina had risen before sunrise to prepare traditional delicacies for the ceremony, her hands moving with practiced precision as she folded banana leaves around rice cakes that would feed the hundreds of people gathering to witness the end of their isolation. Manny arrived by helicopter one final time, but today's landing carried entirely different significance. When he stepped onto the completed highway surface, his feet touched not just asphalt, but the physical manifestation of a promise kept to forgotten communities. Dolores, now serving as the community's official representative, greeted him with barely contained emotion as they prepared for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The new highway stretched magnificently down the mountainside, its smooth surface and proper guardrails creating a stark contrast to the treacherous footpaths that had been the only connection to the outside world for generations. Virginia, the project's final inspection engineer, had certified every kilometer as meeting international safety standards, ensuring that this road would serve communities reliably for decades to come. Representatives from every village along the route had gathered for the celebration, many wearing traditional clothing that honored both their cultural heritage and this momentous transition into a connected future. Theodora organized ceremonial dances that had been passed down through generations, creating a bridge between ancestral traditions and modern possibilities. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was deliberately simple, reflecting the genuine nature of the project's humanitarian goals. As Manny held the ceremonial scissors, surrounded by community leaders who had waited decades for this moment, the weight of transformation was palpable in the mountain air. Minerva, whose children had grown up believing that isolation was their permanent condition, watched with tears streaming down her face as the ribbon fell away. The first official vehicles to travel the completed highway carried medical supplies and educational materials, symbolizing the life-changing services that connectivity would provide. Basilia, the regional health coordinator, rode in the lead ambulance that would now be able to reach emergency situations in these communities within 30 minutes rather than being completely inaccessible during crises. Children ran alongside the vehicles during the inaugural journey, their laughter echoing off the mountain walls as they experienced the magic of watching cars and trucks navigate terrain that had previously been impossible for any motorized transport. Celestina pointed out landmarks to her young grandson, explaining how each curve and bridge represented months of determination and engineering excellence. The economic impact was immediate and visible. Roberta had coordinated with agricultural cooperatives to time the ceremony with the harvest season, and trucks loaded with fresh mountain produce were already waiting to make their first commercial journey to urban markets. Farmers who had accepted below-market prices from exploitative middlemen could now transport their crops directly to fair trade buyers. Educational transformation began within hours of the highway's opening. Serafina, the regional education supervisor, arrived with enrollment materials for high school programs that would now be accessible to mountain youth who had previously been limited to elementary instruction. The sight of teenagers filling out applications for advanced education opportunities created an atmosphere of hope that was almost tangible. As evening approached and the inaugural celebration continued, Manny stood at the highway's highest overlook, surveying the winding road that connected previously isolated communities to the broader world. Avelina, the village elder who had blessed the project during its early planning stages, joined him in quiet contemplation of what had been accomplished. The highway was more than infrastructure. It was a permanent bridge between limitation and possibility, between forgotten communities and endless opportunities. Every vehicle that would travel this road in the years ahead would carry the dreams of people who had never stopped believing in a better future. 2 years after the highway's completion, the transformation of the mountain communities had exceeded even Manny's most optimistic projections. Honorata, who had once carried water for hours each day, now managed a thriving roadside restaurant that served travelers, making the scenic journey through the newly accessible mountain regions. Her establishment had become a symbol of how connectivity could transform individual lives into community success stories. The educational revolution was perhaps the most profound change. Eulalia, the regional high school principal, reported enrollment numbers that had tripled since the highway opened, with mountain youth now competing successfully for university scholarships and professional opportunities that had been unimaginable during their parents' generation. The sight of young people boarding buses each morning to attend advanced educational programs represented a fundamental shift in generational possibilities. Healthcare access had transformed from crisis-driven emergency evacuations to preventive care and routine medical services. Jacinta, the traveling nurse who now made regular rounds to mountain clinics, monitored chronic conditions and provided vaccinations that had previously been impossible to deliver to isolated communities. Infant mortality rates had dropped dramatically, and elderly residents received consistent care that had extended both their lifespans and quality of life. Economic prosperity was visible throughout the region in ways both large and small. Ramona had expanded her coffee farm and now exported premium mountain-grown beans directly to international buyers who appreciated the unique flavor profiles that high-altitude cultivation produced. Her success had inspired other farmers to invest in quality improvements and sustainable practices that attracted premium markets. Small businesses flourished along the highway corridor, creating employment opportunities that kept families together rather than forcing migration to distant cities. Visitation operated a craft cooperative that marketed traditional textiles and woodworking to tourists who had discovered the scenic mountain route. Young adults who might have been forced to leave their communities now found meaningful work close to home. The cultural impact had been equally significant. Constancia, the community's cultural preservation coordinator, had documented traditional practices and stories that were now being shared with visiting students and researchers. Rather than isolating their heritage, connectivity had created opportunities to celebrate and preserve mountain culture while participating in broader educational and economic networks. Manny returned regularly to monitor the ongoing effects of the highway project, each visit revealing new examples of transformation and growth. Mercedes, whose daughter had become the first person from their village to graduate from nursing school, embodied the generational changes that proper access to opportunity could create. The young woman now worked in the regional hospital while maintaining strong connections to her mountain community. Infrastructure improvements had continued beyond the original highway project. Amparo coordinated rural electrification initiatives that brought reliable power to communities for the first time, while Gregoria managed telecommunications projects that provided internet access to mountain schools and businesses. The highway had catalyzed comprehensive development that touched every aspect of community life. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most profound change of all. Flor-de-Lisa, who had spent her entire adult life accepting isolation as an unchangeable reality, now planned international travel to visit relatives who had migrated to other countries decades earlier. The mental shift from limitation to possibility had affected every resident's approach to planning their futures. During his most recent visit, Manny walked the highway he had envisioned during that first helicopter ride, observing the steady flow of traffic that connected mountain communities to opportunities throughout Mindanao and beyond. Children played safely along improved sidewalks, their laughter mixing with the sounds of commerce and progress that had replaced the silence of isolation. The project had proven that individual compassion, when combined with persistent action and adequate resources, could permanently transform entire communities. Every vehicle traveling this mountain highway carried the legacy of one man's refusal to accept that geographic isolation should determine human potential. The forgotten villages had been forgotten no more. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to our channel.